Most men are taught that discipline begins with effort. Wake up earlier. Work harder. Push yourself further. But older traditions saw discipline in a very different way. They believed the first responsibility of a man was not to conquer the world, but to govern himself. Because a man who cannot command his impulses cannot truly command his life. This is where the idea of retention was often misunderstood. To many people today, retention appears to be only about resisting a physical urge, a personal challenge, a private habit. But in many philosophical traditions, restraint was never viewed as simple denial. It was viewed as training, a deliberate practice through which a man learns to pause before impulse, to hold his energy instead of immediately spending it, and to decide consciously how that energy will be used. In that sense, retention becomes something much larger than a rule about behavior. It becomes a practice of self-governance. And like any form of governance, it begins with understanding the territory you are responsible for. For every man, that territory begins within. Today, the word discipline is often associated with productivity. People think of long work hours, strict schedules, and constant effort. Discipline is framed as the ability to keep pushing forward no matter how tired or distracted you feel. But historically, discipline carried a deeper meaning. In many traditions, discipline was less about forcing yourself to do more, and more about learning not to react automatically. It was about creating space between an impulse and an action. Consider how often modern life trains the opposite behavior. A notification appears, and we immediately check it. A moment of boredom arises, and we instantly search for stimulation. An urge appears in the mind, and we follow it without question. Over time, this constant pattern of reaction weakens a man's authority over himself. The impulses begin to lead, and the individual simply follows. This is why practices of restraint were valued so highly in the past. Not because desire itself was considered wrong, but because unexamined desire makes a person easy to control. Retention, in this context, becomes an exercise in remembering an older meaning of discipline. When an impulse appears, the man practicing restraint does something unusual. He pauses. In that pause, something important happens. For a brief moment, the impulse is no longer in charge. The individual is. And it is within that small moment of choice that the first foundations of self-governance begin to form. Before a man can influence anything outside himself, there is a more immediate territory that demands attention. His impulses. Every man carries powerful internal drives. Hunger, ambition, anger, curiosity, desire. These forces are not weaknesses. In many ways, they are the raw fuel of human action. But fuel without direction does not produce strength. It produces chaos. If a man simply reacts whenever an impulse appears, his life gradually becomes a series of reactions rather than deliberate decisions. The impulse appears. The action follows. And the moment passes without reflection. Over time, this pattern quietly erodes a man's sense of control over his own behavior. It begins to feel as though his actions are being pulled forward by forces he barely notices. This is where the idea of governance becomes important. Governance does not mean eliminating impulses. That would be neither realistic nor healthy. Instead, governance means establishing authority over how those impulses are expressed. In other words, the impulse may arise, but the decision still belongs to the individual. Retention becomes one of the most direct ways to practice this principle. Few impulses are as powerful or immediate as sexual desire. It can appear suddenly, demand attention, and push strongly toward immediate satisfaction. When a man learns to pause in the presence of that impulse, when he learns to observe it without immediately acting on it, something subtle begins to change. He discovers that the impulse is not the ruler. It is simply a signal. And like any signal, it can be acknowledged without automatically being obeyed. This realization may seem small at first, but its implications are significant. Because the moment a man understands that he can observe an impulse without immediately following it, he begins to experience a new kind of authority over his own behavior. The impulse still exists. The energy is still present. But now, there is space. And within that space, choice begins to emerge. This is why many traditions treated restraint not as suppression, but as training. A way of strengthening the mind's ability to remain steady even when powerful urges arise. Over time, that steadiness begins to spread into other areas of life. Decisions become slower, more thoughtful. Reactions become less automatic. And the man begins to feel something that is increasingly rare in a world driven by constant stimulation. He begins to feel in command of himself. Across many ancient traditions, restraint was not seen as weakness. In fact, it was often regarded as a sign of strength. Warriors, philosophers, monks, and statesmen in different cultures spoke about the importance of governing one's impulses before attempting to govern anything else. They understood that external power without internal discipline eventually collapses. A man may possess talent, intelligence, or ambition, but if his impulses constantly pull him in different directions, his efforts become scattered. Energy is spent quickly, but little is built. For this reason, restraint was often practiced deliberately, not as punishment, and not as rejection of life, but as a way of strengthening the individual's ability to hold and direct his own energy. When impulses are constantly satisfied the moment they appear, the mind becomes accustomed to immediate release. It expects every desire to be answered quickly. But when a man practices restraint, something different begins to develop. Patience. The ability to sit with an urge without immediately resolving it. The ability to observe desire without feeling controlled by it. This patience slowly builds a form of psychological stability. The mind becomes less reactive, less hurried, less dependent on constant stimulation. In this state, energy begins to accumulate rather than constantly dissipate. And with that accumulation comes clarity. A man who is not constantly pulled by impulse can think more strategically. He can observe situations more calmly. His actions become more intentional rather than impulsive. This is why many ancient traditions quietly emphasized restraint as a foundational discipline. Not because life should be deprived of pleasure, but because a man who cannot pause in the presence of desire cannot truly claim authority over himself. Retention, in this sense, becomes more than a personal habit. It becomes a method through which a man gradually strengthens the most important form of leadership he will ever practice: the leadership of his own mind. If restraint once strengthened a man's independence, it is not surprising that the modern world encourages the opposite. Today, much of the environment is built around stimulation. Devices vibrate for attention. Screens refresh endlessly. Entertainment, novelty, and distraction are always within reach. At first glance, this appears harmless, simply the convenience of modern technology. But beneath the surface, something important is happening. The human mind is being trained to respond instantly to every signal. A notification appears, and the hand reaches for the phone. A moment of boredom emerges, and the mind searches for something to fill it. An urge arises, and it is satisfied immediately. Over time, this constant cycle reduces the amount of space between impulse and reaction. And when that space disappears, self-governance becomes more difficult. This is not necessarily the result of malicious design. Much of modern technology simply competes for attention. Platforms succeed when people remain engaged for longer periods of time. But the effect is still the same. The more a man becomes accustomed to constant stimulation, the harder it becomes for him to tolerate silence, stillness, or restraint. The mind begins to crave immediate reward. It becomes uncomfortable when nothing is happening. This is why many people find practices like retention unexpectedly challenging. Not because the impulse itself is unbearable, but because the mind has grown used to instant release whenever discomfort appears. Retention disrupts that pattern. Instead of reacting immediately, the individual pauses. Instead of seeking quick stimulation, he allows the urge to exist without instantly resolving it. In a world built around constant reaction, this simple act becomes surprisingly uncommon. But it is precisely this uncommon behavior that begins to restore something valuable: the ability to remain steady in the presence of impulse. And when a man can remain steady in that moment, he quietly regains something that modern systems often erode: his authority over his own attention. One of the less discussed effects of retention appears in the way a man directs his attention. Attention is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses. It determines what we think about, what we learn, and ultimately what we build with our lives. Yet in modern life, attention is constantly fragmented. Messages appear. Videos autoplay. Information flows without pause. The mind moves quickly from one stimulus to another, rarely remaining in one place for very long. Over time, this scattered attention becomes a habit. The mind grows restless. Silence feels uncomfortable. Concentration begins to weaken. This is where retention begins to influence more than just physical behavior. When a man practices restraint, he is repeatedly choosing not to follow a powerful impulse the moment it appears. That choice requires attention. It requires awareness of what is happening inside the mind. Instead of reacting automatically, he observes. He notices the rise of the urge. He notices how the mind tries to justify immediate release. He notices the internal pressure to act. And rather than obeying that pressure, he simply allows the moment to pass. Each time this happens, something subtle strengthens. The mind becomes better at holding its focus. Attention stops jumping so quickly from one impulse to the next. Over time, this stability begins to spread into other areas of life. Work becomes easier to concentrate on. Conversations become more present. Thoughts become clearer because the mind is no longer constantly pulled toward the next stimulus. Energy that was previously scattered across many impulses begins to gather. And when attention gathers, clarity often follows. This is why many practitioners of restraint eventually notice a change in how they think. The mind becomes quieter. Not empty, but more deliberate. Instead of chasing every signal that appears, attention begins to move with intention. And when a man can direct his attention deliberately, he is no longer being pulled through life by whatever stimulus happens to appear next. He is choosing where his focus, and therefore his energy, will go. At the beginning, restraint often feels uncomfortable. When a man decides to practice retention, the mind does not immediately become calm or disciplined. In fact, the opposite may happen. Impulses may appear more frequently. The mind may search more aggressively for stimulation. Moments of silence may feel unusually long. This is a natural response. For a long time, the mind may have been accustomed to immediate satisfaction whenever discomfort appeared. An urge arises, and it is resolved instantly. A moment of boredom emerges, and it is filled with stimulation. When that pattern is interrupted, the mind initially resists. It tries to return to what it already knows. But if the individual remains patient, something interesting begins to occur. The urgency of those impulses slowly begins to weaken. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. The mind realizes that the urge does not need to be acted upon immediately in order for the moment to pass. And once that realization becomes familiar, a subtle psychological shift begins to take place. Silence no longer feels threatening. Moments without stimulation become easier to tolerate. The mind becomes less reactive and more observant. Instead of constantly chasing the next form of gratification, it begins to settle. This does not mean the impulses disappear. They remain a natural part of human experience, but they lose their ability to dominate the individual's behavior. The man who once felt compelled to react now finds that he can simply notice the impulse and continue with his day. This is where the deeper value of restraint becomes visible. It is not about suppressing life or denying desire. It is about strengthening the mind's ability to remain steady even when strong internal forces are present. And when that steadiness develops, something quietly returns to the individual. A sense of internal stability. The feeling that one's behavior is not constantly being dictated by whatever impulse happens to arise. This is the beginning of a new relationship with one's own mind. A relationship based not on reaction, but on awareness and choice. When a man begins to practice restraint consistently, the effects slowly extend beyond the original habit. What began as a simple effort to pause before one impulse gradually reshapes how he approaches many areas of life. He begins to notice his reactions more clearly. Moments that once triggered immediate responses now contain a small but important pause. In that pause, he can observe what is happening before deciding how to act. Anger appears, but it is not instantly expressed. Distraction arises, but it does not immediately take control. Desire appears, but it is no longer automatically obeyed. This ability to pause may seem small, but it changes the structure of a man's behavior in profound ways. Because the individual who can pause is the individual who can choose. And choice is the foundation of self-governance. A man who governs himself does not eliminate his emotions or impulses. Instead, he understands them. He allows them to exist without allowing them to dictate his actions. His attention becomes something he protects. His energy becomes something he directs. His time becomes something he values. In this state, the individual becomes far less predictable to the forces that normally pull at human behavior. he is less reactive to distraction, less controlled by impulse, less dependent on constant stimulation. Instead, his decisions begin to follow intention rather than pressure. And this is where the deeper meaning of self-governance reveals itself. It is not about rigid control or constant resistance. It is about developing the quiet authority to decide which impulses deserve action and which ones simply deserve observation. The man who develops this authority does not feel constantly pulled in different directions. He moves with purpose. And that purpose begins with something simple, yet increasingly rare: the ability to command himself. When a man consistently governs his impulses, the benefits begin to reveal themselves in subtle, yet profound ways. Clarity emerges where there was once confusion. The mind, no longer constantly scattered, begins to think in longer, more deliberate patterns. Emotions no longer control behavior. Instead, they are observed, understood, and channeled. Decisions become intentional rather than reactive. Energy that was once wasted on fleeting impulses is now available for action that matters. This transformation does not happen overnight. It is gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But over time, the accumulation of small, deliberate pauses creates a profound internal shift. The man begins to notice the quiet power of his own presence. He no longer feels tossed about by circumstance or craving. His attention is his own. His energy is his own. His life, increasingly, feels directed rather than accidental. Retention, when understood as more than a rule or a habit, becomes a philosophy of living deliberately. It is not merely the withholding of energy, it is the practice of directing energy where it matters most. A man who practices this learns that true power is not demonstrated through force or indulgence. It is shown quietly, in steadiness, clarity, and the ability to act with intention. And in that quiet power lies something that the modern world rarely teaches: the authority of a man who governs himself from within. The world teaches men to chase stimulation, notifications, entertainment, instant gratification. They all demand a piece of your attention, your energy, your will. But mastery does not begin by giving in. It begins by learning to pause. Retention is not just a personal habit, it is a practice of self-governance. By observing your impulses, by holding your energy, by choosing when and how to act, you quietly reclaim authority over your own life. This authority spreads into every decision, every interaction, every pursuit. It is the foundation for clarity, focus, and deliberate action. If something in this video resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Where in your life are you letting impulses lead? Where can you pause, observe, and reclaim your energy? If you value grounded discussions on discipline, energy, and modern life, consider subscribing to the channel. Join the conversation in the comments. Share your experiences, challenges, and insights. Because self-governance is not learned in a single lesson. It is lived, moment by moment, choice by choice.